Chapter 9, in which Thorindel is a dreadful nuisance and Cimorene casts a spell. The rest of the trip home was uneventful. Passing through the king's cave seemed easier going in the opposite direction, and the impenetrable darkness only descended once. As soon as they arrived, Kuzil took the book Morwen had lent them and curled herself around a rock just outside the mouth of the cave to study it while the princess made dinner. She pored over the book all evening, and Cimorene found it fascinating to watch the dragon delicately turning pages with her claws. Early the next day, Kuzul went off to consult with Roxam. The princess was rather stiff from all the dragon riding she had done the previous day, so she decided not to do any more cleaning. Instead, she spent the morning in Kuzul's treasure room, sorting through bottles and jars for those that might possibly contain powdered hen's teeth. Remembering Kuzul's advice, she started by setting aside all the bottles she could find that had lead stoppers. Since the light was not very good, she took the jars and bottles that looked as if they might be worth investigating and piled them in her apron so as to carry them outside more easily. She had nearly finished sorting when she heard a voice calling faintly in the distance. "Ugh, bother," she said. "I did hope they'd leave me alone a little longer." She bundled the last 5 bottles into her apron without looking at them, and not forgetting to lock the door behind her, hurried out through the maze to see who was shouting for her this time. It was Thorindel. "What are you doing here?" Cimorene said crossly. "I told you I wasn't going to be ready to be rescued for at least a month." "I was worried," Thorindel said. "I heard that you'd broken a leg, but you look fine to me." "Of course I haven't broken a leg," Cimorene said. "Where did you get that idea?" "Some night at the inn at the foot of the mountain," Thorindel replied. "He was up yesterday talking to the princess he's trying to rescue, and he came back and warned everybody not to bother with the princess that was captured by the dragon Kuzul. Well, I knew that was you, so I asked why, and he said his princess told him you'd broken your leg and wouldn't be able to walk for months." Cimorene smiled slightly. Eleonora had apparently gone through with her plan to tell Halana about Cimorene's twisted ankle, and Halana had decided to improve the story a little in hopes of reducing the competition. "Somebody must have gotten mixed up," Cimorene said gently. "You can stop worrying. I'm fine. Is that all you came for? These jars are getting heavy, and I've got work to do." "Cimorene, we have to talk," Thorindel said in a heavy, deep voice. "Then we'll have to do it while I work," she declared. She turned on her heel and marched into the kitchen, full of annoyance. She had been feeling almost friendly towards him, and he hadn't been worried about her after all, until he said he wanted to talk. She was quite sure that he wanted to talk about rescuing her, and she was annoyed with him for being stupidly stubborn and annoyed with herself for being annoyed when he was only trying to do the best he could. He followed her into the kitchen. "What is all that?" he asked as she put the apron full of jars on the kitchen table and began lining them up. "Some things I'm checking for Kuzul," she said. She picked up a small jar made of carved jade and pried the lid off. It was half full of green salve. She put the lid back on and set the jar aside. "What was it you wanted to talk about?" she asked, reaching for another jar. "You? Dragons? Us? That looks interesting. Can I help?" "As long as you don't break anything," she said. "Some of these are very fragile." Maybe opening jars would make him forget about you, dragons, us, for a while. "I'll be very careful," he assured her. "This one looks like metal. I'll start with that, shall I?" He picked up one of the larger jars made of beaten copper with 2 handles. He frowned at the top, then reached for his dagger as he tilted the jar. She saw that the neck was stopped up with lead. "Not that one," she said quickly. She didn't remember picking out that particular jar. It must have been one of the last 4 or 5 that she scooped up when she heard him calling. "Why not?" he said, sounding rather hurt. "I said I'd be careful." The tip of his dagger was already embedded in the lead. Kuzul said to leave the ones with the lead stoppers alone, so put it back. "If you insist," he said, shrugging. He pulled on his dagger, but it was stuck fast on the lead. Drat," he said, and twisted the handle. The dagger came free, and the lead stopper came along with it. "I should have known," she said in a resigned tone. A black cloud of smoke poured out of the jar. As Cimorene and Thorindel watched, it condensed into a dark-skinned giant wearing only a turban and a loincloth. He was more than twice as tall as the prince, and the corners of his mouth were turned down in a stern frown. "What is it?" whispered Thorindel. "Trouble," said the princess. "Thou speakest "Truly, O daughter of wisdom," said the giant in a booming voice that filled the cave, "for I am a djinn who is imprisoned in that jar, and I am the instrument of thy death and that of thy paramour." "My what?" she said, outraged. "Thy lover," the djinn said uncomfortably, "the man who stands beside thee." "I know what you meant," she said, "but he isn't my lover or my fiancé or my boyfriend or anything, and I refuse to be killed with him." "But, Cimorene, you know perfectly well," Thorndale started. "You hush," Cimorene said. "You made enough of a mess already. If he is not thy paramour, nor any of those other things, then what is he?" the djinn asked suspiciously. "A nuisance," the princess said. "Cimorene, you're not being very kind," Thorndale said. "What he is matters not," the djinn said grandly after a moment's heavy thought. "It is enough that thou and he shall die." "Enough for whom?" Cimorene said. The djinn blinked at her. "For me. 'Tis my will that thou and he shall die by my hand. Thou hast but to choose the manner of thy death." "Old age," Cimorene said promptly. "Mock me not. Thou and he shall die, and by my hand, ere this day draws to its close," the djinn cried. "Do you suppose he means it?" Thorndale said nervously. "Why would he keep bellowing it at us if he didn't mean it?" she said. "Do be quiet, Thorndale." Thorndale lowered his voice. "Should I offer to fight him, do you think?" "Don't be silly," she said. She saw that Thorndale was distressed, so she added, "You came up here to fight a dragon. You aren't prepared for a djinn, and nobody could reasonably expect you to challenge him." "If you say so," Thorndale said, looking relieved. The princess turned back to the djinn and saw that he, too, was looking perturbed. "What's the matter with you?" she said crossly. "Dost thou not wish to know why I killed thee?" the djinn asked plaintively. "What difference does it make?" Cimorene said. "Yes, actually," the prince said at the same time. "Thorndale!" "Shut up!" "Hear my story, O luckless pair," the djinn said with evident relief. "I am one of those djinns who did rebel against the law of our kind, and for my crimes I was sentenced to imprisonment in this bottle until the day should come when human hands will loose me. As is the custom of my people, I swore that whoso should release me during the first 100 years of my imprisonment, I would make ruler of the earth, and whoso should release me during the second 100 years, I should make rich beyond all dreams of men. Whoso shall release me during the third 100, I should grant 3 wishes. And whoso should release me after any longer span of time, I should grant only the choice of what death he should die." "You're going to kill us because it's traditional?" the princess asked. "Yes," the djinn said. His eyes slid away from Cimorene's, and she frowned suddenly. "Just how long were you in that jar?" she demanded. Well, actually," the djinn's voice trailed off. "How long?" she insisted. 217 years, the djinn admitted, "but nobody ever releases a djinn before the 300 years are over." "You're trying to get around your oath," Thorndale said, plainly shocked by the very thought. "You pretended you had to kill us so you wouldn't have to give us the wishes." No, the djinn said. "Thinkest thou that the granting of wishes alone would so trouble me? Needs must I kill thee and thy fair companion, for I cannot return home and say thou didn't release me and I left thee living. I would be a laughing-stock. Never in 3,000 years has such a thing occurred." "Then you shouldn't have sworn an oath," Thorndale said sternly. "I had to," the djinn said miserably. "It is the custom of our kind. 'Twould be improper," Cimorene murmured. "'Twould be improper to do otherwise," the djinn said, nodding. "But now thou hast found me out, and what am I to do? If I kill thee, it will violate my oath. If I kill thee not, the remainder of my life will be a torment." "You could go back in the jar for another 83 years, she suggested delicately. "I could go back?" The djinn blinked at her for a moment. I could go back! And in 83 years we'll both be dead of old age," Cimorene said. "Since that was my choice of death, your oath will be fulfilled, and you can go straight home without killing anyone else, or giving any man riches or power or anything. Truly thou art a jewel among women, and the very queen of wisdom's daughters," the djinn said happily. "Thou hast found the perfect solution to my difficulties." "Wait a minute," Thorndale said. "What about those wishes?" Thorindel, she said in a shocked tone. I'm surprised at you. How can he give us wishes if he's going back in the jar for 83 years? It wouldn't be right at all. The prince frowned. Are you sure? After all, we did let him out during his 300 years. I suppose I could let thee have one wish at least, in token of my thanks for thy help, the Djinn said, as long as thou dost not tell anyone. I wouldn't dream of it, the prince assured him, and my wish is to defeat a dragon and win his princess's hand in marriage. The Djinn waved a dark hand over Thorindel's head. There, when next thou dost fight a dragon, thou shalt surely defeat him. And thou, he said, turning to Cimorene. I could use some powdered hen's teeth, she said. The Djinn blinked in surprise, but he waved his hand again, his face a mask of concentration. Then he bowed and handed Cimorene a fat brown jar. There's thy desire. Farewell. And with an elaborate salaam, the Djinn dissolved back into a cloud of smoke that poured back into the copper jar from which it had come. Cimorene leaned over and plucked the lead stopper from the end of Thorindel's knife. She jammed it back into place and heaved a sigh of relief. The prince was not paying attention. What did you want something like that for? He asked, looking at the jar of hen's teeth, wrinkling his nose in distaste. I don't believe I should tell you, she said, putting the jar carefully into one of her apron pockets. It has nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with me, he said indignantly. I'm going to marry you just as soon as I beat that dragon of yours. I don't think you're going to beat Kazul, Cimorene said in a considering tone. But that Djinn just said. He said that if you fight a dragon, you'll defeat him. But Kazul is a her, not a him, she pointed out, and you ought not to be trying to rescue me anyway. Why not? He asked. Because there are other princesses who have been captives of dragons for much longer than I have, and they have seniority, she explained. Oh, said, looking considerably taken aback. How do you know? They came to visit and told me all about it, she said. I think you should try for Caradwell. She's from the kingdom of Raxwell, and her hair is the color of sun-ripened wheat, and she wears a gold crown set with diamonds. You ought to get along with her very well. He brightened perceptibly at this description and said, But everyone expects me to rescue you. As long as you defeat a dragon and rescue a princess, no one will care, she said firmly. And Caradwell will suit you much better than I would. Are you sure her dragon isn't female too? Positive, she said. Gommel's cave is 2 down and 3 over. If you follow the path outside, you can't miss it. He ought to be there now, and if you leave right away, you'll be able to get everything settled before dinner. All right, then, he said, as long as you're sure you don't mind. Not at all, she assured him. She saw him to the mouth of the cave and pointed him toward Gommel's cave, then returned to the kitchen. She gathered up the jars and bottles she had been planning to check, except for the copper jar with the Djinn inside, and took them back to the treasure vault. Then she fetched an ink pot, a quill pen, and a sheet of paper from the library, and began writing out a warning to attach to the copper jar. She didn't want anyone else to open it until 83 years were over, and the Djinn could go home without killing anyone. She was just finishing when she heard Eleanor's voice calling from the rear of the cave. I'm in the kitchen, she shouted. Come on back. You're always in the kitchen, Eleanor said when she poked her head through the door a moment later. Or the library. Don't you ever do anything but cook and read? Look at this, Eleanor, she said, handing her the warning she'd been writing. Do you think it's clear enough? Warning. This jar contains a Djinn who will kill you if you let him out too soon. Do not open until at least 105 years after the date when the citadel of the Yellow Giant was destroyed. She read out loud. That's, let's see, 84 years from now. Seems clear to me. You have to be pretty stupid to ignore a warning like that. Maybe I ought to show it to Halana and see what she says, Cimorene said, frowning. I wouldn't want anyone getting into trouble by accident just because I didn't make it plain. It's plain, it's plain. Cimorene, what on earth have you been doing, and how do you know there's a Djinn in that bottle? Thorindel, Cimorene said, waving a hand expressively. I was looking through some of the bottles from Kazul's treasure room to see if any of them happened to have hen's teeth in them, and Thorindel came in and wanted to help. And he opened it. Oh dear. Exactly. But it came out well in the end. I think I've gotten rid of him for good. I sent him off to rescue Caradwell. You did? What if he doesn't beat Gummel? Oh, he'll win. The Djinn gave him a wish, and he wished to defeat a dragon. Cimorene looked apologetic at Eleanor. I suppose I ought to have sent him to rescue you, but that's quite all right, she said hastily. Getting rid of Caradwell might help a lot, and after everything you've told me about Thorindel, I don't think I want to have him rescue me. That's what I thought. Oh, and I got the djinn to give me powdered hen's teeth so we can finally try that fireproofing spell. Good. Let's do it right now. So Cimorene got out the spell and the ingredients she had collected, and she and Eleonora spent the next hour on various necessary preparations. First, they had to boil some unicorn water and steep the dried wolfsbane in it. Then the mixture had to be strained and mixed with hippopotamus oil and the powdered hen's teeth. Cimorene did most of that, while the other princess ground up the blue rose leaves and a piece of ebony. Grinding the ebony took a long time, but fortunately they didn't need much. When Eleonora finally had enough, Cimorene mixed it with the blue rose leaves and more of the unicorn water and one of Kazul's recently shed scales. Each mixture had to be stirred 3 times counterclockwise with a white eagle feather. Then Eleonora dipped the point of her feather in the mixture and began drawing a star on the floor of the cave. "Is this going to be big enough for both of us?" she asked, scratching busily at the stone with the tip of the feather. "I think so. Don't try to make it too big or you'll run out of liquid and we'll have to start over." She had not run out, though she had used nearly all of her mixture by the time she finished. "There," she said. She sat back on her heels and studied her diagram to make sure there were no gaps, then set her dragon scale and feather aside and stood up. "Your turn. First we have to get into the center of the star," she reminded her. "Be careful not to smudge the lines." "Smudge them after all that work?" she said in tones of mock horror. She lifted her skirts and stepped carefully into the middle of the diagram. Cimorene followed, carrying a small mixing bowl half full of something that looked like brown sludge with a white eagle feather sticking out of one side. "It smells awful," she grimaced. "It doesn't matter what it smells like as long as the spell works," Cimorene said. "Ready?" "As ready as I'm ever going to be," she replied, shutting her eyes and screwing up her face as if she expected to have a glass of cold water poured over her head. Cimorene plucked the eagle feather out of the bowl and raised it quickly over Eleonora's head before it could drip on the floor. She let out 4 large drops of the brown gunk fall into her hair, then brushed the end of the feather across her forehead twice. She finished by drawing a circle with the feather on the palm of Eleonora's left hand. "Tickles," Eleonora complained. "Well, you can do it for me now," Cimorene said. Eleonora took the bowl and feather from Cimorene. "You're right. It does tickle." "Now what?" Eleonora asked. "Set the bowl down and shut your eyes," Cimorene instructed. When Eleonora had done so, Cimorene closed her own eyes and said, "Power of water, wind and earth, turn the fire back to its birth. Raise the spell to shield the flame by the power that we have tamed." "Oh," said Eleonora, "that feels peculiar. Can I open my eyes now?" "Yes," said Cimorene, opening her own. "We're finished." "Did it work?" she asked, cautiously opening one eye and squinting at Cimorene. "Well, something happened. We both felt it," Cimorene said, "and your hair and forehead don't have the brown gunk on them anymore." Eleonora promptly opened both eyes and studied Cimorene. "Neither do yours." "What does that mean?" "It means we go back to the kitchen and test it," Cimorene said. She bent over and picked up the mixing bowl. "We'll clean it up later. Come on." And Chapter 10 will be in which Cimorene and Eleonora conduct some tests and disturb a wizard.